Can't decide and torn between a romantic, comedy, action, or an indie film to watch for the weekend? Well. Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast is your ultimate guide to the latest movies. Join us as we dissect the latest on the blockbusters. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum, and I hope that you are all having a wonderful weekend. Today is June 28th, episode 168, and congratulations, you don't have to listen to a super long intro today. I have done all of the necessary introductions and explanations. So today we're going to get right into the episode, an episode that I am very excited to talk about because I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite genres of all time, which is teen coming of age movies. And most of the reason behind that is because of the new movie that I watched this week called Big Time Adolescence. Came out about a month and a half ago. Hulu original starring Pete Davidson. So that's segment one. That's movie one. And then something that's really fun this week is that I know I'm going to do in the future a rewatch or a new watch and then a recommendation. And this one just so happens to be a rewatch that could have also been a recommendation. So there's going to be two movies that I absolutely adore this week. Because the rewatch for me, so my most recent watch, is Clueless, a movie that I talked about a little bit in that top 10 movies on Netflix because it is new streaming to Netflix, I think, again, about a month and a half. It's one of my favorite movies of all time. I rewatched it for the first time about a week ago now, and it shot up on my top 10, top 20 list. So I am ecstatic to talk about that movie. And so it really could have been a recommendation. It's one of my favorite movies ever. But that gives me the opportunity to bring up another movie as my recommendation that is another film that I absolutely love. Came out last year. It was my favorite movie of last year. It's called Booksmart. It's the directorial debut from Olivia Wilde. I saw it twice in theaters. I love it. It's a wonderful coming-of-age movie for a modern audience. And then with my last segment this week, I'm going to do a top 5 because I want to do those about once a week. And given that this is the last episode coming out in June, and June is Pride Month, I figured that I would run down some of my favorite Pride LGBTQ plus related films. Booksmart kind of segues nice into that. It has a queer character as one of its leads, a pretty central plot line to the film. And so I figured that I would run down some of my favorite movies involving main LGBTQ plus characters. So I'm super excited to talk about that. And we're going to get right into it today. All right, so Big Time Adolescence is a brand new film streaming exclusively to Hulu. It's directed by Jason Orley, stars Pete Davidson, Griffin Gluck, and John Cryer. It essentially follows Monroe, who goes by Mo, a 16-year-old sophomore in high school, as he navigates high school with his best friend Zeke, a 22-year-old college dropout who's navigating early adulthood, and just so happens to be Mo's sister's ex-boyfriend. The two of them had met 6 years prior and formed a very brotherly bond, and now they're both trying to get their lives together. Mo might be on a better track than Zeke currently is. So I did not have many expectations going into this film because I did not know a lot about this film. In fact, I knew so little that in the introduction, I said that it came out a month, maybe month and a half ago, and time is so skewed in quarantine that apparently it came out in March. So that's a month or a month and a half ago to me. Just so everybody knows. It was an official Sundance selection though, so it has been in the talking points of film and recent film buffs since 2019. Hulu got the exclusive rights to stream it, pushed it up a week once quarantine began, so it was always going to release on Hulu. They were going to get a little bit of a limited theatrical release because up until quarantine, obviously, you had to have a theatrical release to be qualified for the Oscars, so that's what they wanted to do. That is no longer the case this year, at the very least. But like I said, I did not have many expectations. I think I saw the trailer once, knew very little about it, and I will say that I did enjoy a lot of it. I think there are some pretty glaring problems that I had with it that I'll go into later that I wanted to enjoy it more than I did. I really, really enjoyed the beginning. So I'll start with some of the things that I loved about it because that's what I want to do. And I did ultimately enjoy a lot of this film. So I'll start with those. The big standout of that being Pete Davidson. I will say up front that I can say confidently that I'm a Pete Davidson fan. I always enjoyed him on SNL. I think his stand-up is pretty darn funny. So there is a little bit of him playing himself in this movie, and that seems pretty clear. Obviously, I don't know the guy, but given his public persona, his online persona, he does seem to be playing a pretty similar role. And whether that is a knock or a plus side for you, he nails it. He does a very good job. I thought particularly his comedic timing and delivery were fantastic. I mean, he is the youngest SNL cast member, I believe, ever, at least at the time that he was hired. And you can see where that comes from. He's very funny. There wasn't a single line. I think I said it out loud. I was watching this with a friend, and I said it out loud that I was like, this Pete Davidson has nailed every single line delivery. Like, that was pretty apparent. Whether his acting was on point when he wasn't saying a line, I wasn't necessarily looking for that. I didn't notice anything inherently wrong with it. But every single line was either very, very funny or very down to earth. He definitely had the most memorable, notable, like kind of laugh out loud lines. And the comedy in this film is very natural. So they've got a very strong chemistry between all of the main characters and a lot of the side characters too, which I thought was really wonderful. All of them are playing, I think, realistic people and then kind of versions of either themselves or people that they know. It's not necessarily a stretch probably for a lot of these actors, and that might be why a lot of it feels very natural, but there's a lot of scenes with either lots of young people or lots of people kind of in their early 20s, and then a couple family dynamic scenes that's just sort of kids sort of goofing around doing dumb stuff, and it works really well, and all of them have very wonderful chemistry. And so I will give that little shout out to Griffin Gluck, who plays Mo. He is the technical lead of the film. I will say that Pete Davidson is the make or break character in this film because he was kind of the centerpiece of the marketing. He's not necessarily the main character. He is definitely one of the main characters, and I would argue that he's probably the emotional core of the movie. And so if he doesn't work, the movie doesn't work. But Griffin Gluck does do a very good job in his role as Mo. I'll say that I think that his chops lie on the opposite side of what Pete Davidson lies on. So Pete Davidson feels very genuine most of the time, but I would say that he's much stronger at comedy than he is drama. Griffin Gluck Mo is the other way. His comedy feels a little bit stiffer, I think, than Pete Davidson, and that might be just given the two characters that they both get, but his drama and his dramatic acting, I think, really show up towards the end of the movie, which I thought was really great. And I will give a shout out to him because he is in one of my favorite TV shows right now. Unfortunately, it got canceled. It's on Netflix called American Vandal. I would highly recommend that show. And I do think he's a little bit better in that one than he was in this, which is why I might be criticizing him a little bit more than I should. But check out American Vandal. That's my TV show recommendation for the day. And I can give you a second TV show recommendation for the day because a supporting character in this movie is Sydney Sweeney, who's in Euphoria. And she's also a very fun character to have. She's light. She's kind. I do wish she had been given a little bit more to do in the movie. She's kind of this side piece character that gets thrown around between some of the main characters at certain points. I do think she has a very strong characterization, but that seems to rely more on her than it does in the writing and the screenplay. So I would have liked more for her to do. There's a lot of characters in this film that don't get the closure that I would have liked. In fact, I would argue that nobody gets the closure. That seems to be a trend that is happening in lots of films, and it's a trend that I don't necessarily dislike, but I mean, everyone likes a happy ending, for sure. This film kind of has one, but definitely leans in towards that ambiguity, and particularly with a lot of the characters and character relationships, I would have wanted maybe a little bit of a tighter ending. The screenplay is very tight, though, and I think the performances are kind of what create that to me. I haven't read the screenplay. I don't know how much of it was improv. Not a lot of that knowledge seems to be public. It feels like it could have been a lot of improv. That chemistry seems to allow for that, but it doesn't seem like improv that is forced or that is apparent. A lot of times with certain comedy films, and particularly certain directors and actors, you can kind of tell when they're riffing and improving different scenes, and you're like, okay, I get it. I get the joke. They're all kind of trying to outbit each other. This one, the improv feels very natural, like they're just kind of friends. And I do think that is because of the acting and the actors. I would say that was primarily my favorite part of the film. I did not realize that John Cryer was even in this movie because he doesn't look like John Cryer. I had looked at the IMDb page either before or during the movie, and I was like, "Oh, John Cryer's in this. I wonder when he's going to show up." And I think he's in the first or second scene because he plays the dad, and I just didn't realize. And he does really, really well. There is kind of a thing that stands out in my mind as far as the screenplay and the story being told. The women in the film get sidelined a lot more than the men do. Many of the male characters are the standouts of the film and just have a lot more to do, even the side characters. So there are some pretty prominent female characters in the film, but they serve as more of a vehicle for some of the male development, which I can say that I dislike. I would have preferred some stronger characterization for them, and there are some choices that don't make a lot of sense, but there are some choices with them that do make a lot of sense. So I will say that I don't know if that is a knock at the screenplay because I haven't read it, but what is depicted on screen, the screenplay is pretty tight despite all of that, and there are some counter examples to that, particularly with Griffin Gluck's Moe's love interest, who, let's see, what's her name? What's the actress's name? Una Lawrence, who plays Sophie. So she's very good, and I had never seen her in anything, so I really enjoyed that. The one thing that I didn't like about the screenplay, that now I'm going to get into a little bit more of the negatives of the film, is there's a pretty apparent tonal switch about 2/3 of the way through the movie that I wish had been foreshadowed a little bit more, particularly either in the marketing or in the early stages of the film. The first scene of the film definitely shows it because it kind of starts at the end, which is a very exhausted cliche in coming of age films and wasn't my favorite part. Probably not the best way to get that intro going. But despite that, the tonal shift is pretty unexpected. It takes a very hard left turn from being very light, very funny. In fact, very funny. I'll emphasize that one more time. I was laughing out loud a lot. And then it gets pretty heavy, pretty dark. And a lot of the character building moments that led to this sort of dark, more mature tone get glossed over in montages, which is a little bit disappointing and a little bit, I hesitate to say lazy because it's hard to be lazy when making a film, but unfortunately that is kind of how it feels when watching it. So I wish that had been hinted at earlier on, or at least the tonal shift had not been so drastic. And then the ending of the film is a much larger downbeat than I would have anticipated from the trailer and from the beginning of the film. So there is that. I would expect that going in, anticipate that going in. And that's partially because of the screenplay, I believe, and a little bit because of the filmmaking. None of that is really hinted at. That being said, though, the direction is pretty good. I actually wrote in my notes that it is plain, but I think a lot of the strong directorial choices because this is a first-time director. He directed Pete Davidson's stand-up special, but this is his first feature film. But a lot of the directorial choices seem to be very subtle, but very, very necessary. And if you look hard enough, are definitely there. I would actually be curious to rewatch it. One of the biggest choices to me is just how the movie feels overall. It feels very dirty, very grimy, which isn't necessarily the portrayal of the suburbs that you get very often. Even in the graphics and the title cards feel very dirty, slimy, kind of gross, and the whole movie kind of has this gray color grading over it to really emphasize that. It kind of feels like concrete, and then you get to a point in the movie where it almost feels like you're walking through concrete, so it's a little bit hard to watch towards that middle end of the film. So I will definitely say that. The music and the score I wouldn't say is anything all that memorable. There is some fun choices with the music, but particularly they use a song called Mo Bamba, and the main character's name is Mo, and they kind of emphasize that. It's a little heavy-handed, but I did like it regardless. The cinematography, though, is surprisingly good. I was surprised at how good it was. There are some pretty strong wide shots. It's definitely easier to flex your cinematography chops when you're doing wide shots. You can do a lot of cool dynamic things, but I will say that a lot of the choices for close-ups and dialogue scenes were also very good. So I will say the cinematography was a surprising factor that doesn't necessarily call attention to itself, which I thought was very nice. So overall, I did enjoy this movie, particularly 2/3. I would say that I would anticipate it being a little bit more of a dramatic downer of a film than I did. I definitely was anticipating more comedy. The beginning is very, very funny, so it may throw you off when that tonal shift happens. But regardless, I think it is a good film. My expectations may have played into that overall feeling, so maybe watching it again, that tonal shift doesn't feel as drastic. So knowing that, I would say as long as you're expecting that, I think you can expect a very good time, and some very interesting themes that get thrown throughout with growing up, adolescence, adulthood, maturity, lots and lots of things, respect. So I'm going to give this movie a strong 6, only because I give 7s to a lot of movies, and I don't know if it's necessarily as strong as some of those films. So that feels a little bit weaker, even though I did enjoy it. So this movie gets a strong 6, emphasis on the strong. So that's Big Time Adolescence. It's streaming right now on Hulu. I would say I recommend it, but I don't recommend it nearly as much as my next 2 films, which are Clueless and then Booksmart, and then stay tuned until the very end where I rank my top 5 Pride films of all time. So stay tuned for all of that, and right now we're going to take a quick break.
Want to know the latest and hottest music hitting the airwaves? Don't be left out. Listen to the Golden State Media Concepts Music Podcast. It keeps you on the loop with everything you need to know from pop, rock, hip-hop, and the top 40. And we'll throw in news of your favorite artists, concert and tour dates, and so much more. Listen no further, because this is the gold standard in music podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. And if you are just tuning in or skipping around, I have just given my review of Big Time Adolescence. I am now going to give my review on Clueless and then Booksmart. And make sure you stay tuned until the very end where I run down my top 5 Pride movies of all time. So right now is Clueless, which I have already talked about a little bit in my first episode a week ago, 2 episodes ago. I love this movie. I might ramble a little bit, but I'm going to go a little bit more in depth than I had in that episode. So Clueless is streaming right now on Netflix. Came out in 1995. I almost said 96. But it follows Cher, who is a shallow but stylish teenager in high school as she meddles in the relationships of her friends, her classmates, her teachers, and ultimately tries to find a relationship herself while trying to grow and become a much more healthy and functional adult. It's directed and written by Amy Heckerling, and it stars Alicia Silverstone, Stacey Dash, and Paul Rudd. So, oh my gosh, I love this movie. It had originally been in my top 20, and then I hadn't rewatched it, but just I'm obsessed with lists and making sure that they're the way that I want them to be. So it had moved to number 10, wanted to make sure it was in my top 10 because I love this movie, and then I rewatched it, and oh my god, it's even better than I remember. And so now it's number 4. So this would have been my recommendation for the week if I hadn't rewatched it. So I do get to recommend 2 great movies, and I would honestly say that, actually, I mean, it's pretty obvious if it's number 4 of my favorite movies, but this is my biggest recommendation for the week. It's my favorite of the week that I'm reviewing. So I'm going to be a little bit looser on spoilers for this one. Don't worry, I won't spoil the ending. I won't spoil anything super, super major, but I'm going to be not as strict as far as what I talk about, because it came out in 1995. So there's a little bit less of an excuse for you to know what's going on. But if you haven't seen it, could not recommend this movie more enough. And I'll explain why. So I said this in my mini review in that top 10 list, but it is one of, if not my favorite script ever written. I love this script. And I primarily like this script because it functions as 2 things. It's super complex and has a lot of very grand themes and topics and ideas that are packaged in a much almost superficial way, in the way that people talk and say these things, and in a very high school way, for sure. It's not quite natural dialogue, so it's not very realistic necessarily, but it is said in a way that is more palatable, I would say, to an audience or teenagers. And I really, really like it because it's based on Emma, so that's a Jane Austen novel and story. And Jane Austen books were written a very long time ago, so they're written in older English. And so this film uses slang and very over-the-top slang, 90s slang, as sort of the language barrier that you might have when reading a Jane Austen book, which I think is kind of ingenious and maybe not even intentional. I would have to say that it's intentional. I don't know how it wouldn't be. But the complexity of reading a Jane Austen book and sort of the intricacy of language becomes much sillier, but still just as pervasive in the script for Clueless. So it's a phenomenal reimagining of the story. And then in watching Emma, because I had never read it, I had never seen any adaptation, but I obviously reviewed it a couple episodes ago, and the parallels stand out, but they're not necessarily everywhere. They're not everything is reliant on the base story, which I think is the perfect way to do an adaptation. So this might be unpopular. This might be one of my hotter takes, but I have to say that if you're going to do an adaptation for a film, it should be different, and I would say almost every time it should be very different. And I say that because if you are creating content for one medium, it's very clearly for that medium, and there are different ways that works. There's a language for film, there's a language for books, music, obviously. And so when you translate it, it's not necessarily going to work as being the same thing. And so it should be different, and you should use the techniques, the tactics, and all of the ways that you can make that story different and better in the medium that you're adapting it to. So in the case of this, changing the entire story was obviously the way that Amy Heckerling wanted to go, and the way that she did go, and it works beautifully. So this is a perfect adaptation in my mind. Like I said, with that dialogue, it's a little bit silly, it's a little bit over the top, but because of that, it ends up being hilarious. And I might say this a couple times in the review, sorry, but it is iconic. And I always hesitate to use that word because it's a little bit malleable. You don't necessarily know what that means all the time. It's like it can kind of be up for interpretation as to who's saying it, what they're talking about. But this movie's been out long enough. A lot of the phrases that are used have been used in pop culture and kind of given that iconography, that sort of status title. But you can honestly, I would have to imagine you can tell when you watch a movie what movies are going to do that and become iconic. And this one, in every angle of the film, does that. So the dialogue is just one of those. And so all of the lines, almost like half of those iconic lines made me laugh out loud again after having seen the movie before. So it's hilarious. It's wonderful. And it's super silly, which I keep saying. And I said this again last week, that I really appreciate when a movie is given the chance to be a movie and it doesn't have to necessarily be bogged down in realism. And this is one of those films. It is so silly and over the top and so movie-y. I'll get to a little bit more of that later on in this review. But I'll move on to the performances because they are just as over the top. You could potentially do this kind of aesthetic as like an SNL skit, and it would also work because it's so over the top. And the world is over the top, so the actors are given the chance to also give performances like that, and none of them take themselves seriously, which I think is the downfall of a lot of films, even serious films, when they take themselves too seriously. And the leader of that, as far as the performances go, is Alicia Silverstone. She's so wonderful in this movie, and I say that because of how sympathetic she is. She gives a very shallow character that if any of us met in real life would probably despise. A very strong characterization, and with the use of voiceover, and I would say the use of a lot of action, not even necessarily dialogue, but a lot of the quiet moments that we get with Cher, which aren't necessarily, they're a little bit more few and far between, but we do still get them, which is nice. So all of the acting from Alicia Silverstone that isn't even dialogue acting is very strong, and we get that sense of sympathetic. We get the sympathetic notion from her, because anytime there is dialogue, and some of that iconic dialogue, she is a very strong character and has very strong values and is not afraid to share them, which is also very refreshing. So I adore her character. I love her character. I think she is a fantastic actress in this in particular. And ultimately, we care about all of the characters, and we care because they care. All of them seem to care about each other, regardless of how snotty they all are. And they seem to care about themselves. And there's a level of self-awareness that I don't think is given to a lot of characters like this. I mean, there's a little bit of that in Mean Girls, which is a common comparison to Clueless. I will say I don't personally believe there's any comparison, except for maybe in the iconic status. But the self-awareness that is given to pretty much every main character, despite maybe some of the stoner characters, is very, very refreshing and is not even seen really now, because they're these sort of shallow, preppy, popular girls, but are very aware of who they are, what their status is. And Cher in particular is aware of how she feels. And even in those moments where she feels down and out and not included, she makes the audience aware of it. And we get to really see that both in her face and in the dialogue, and in particular the voiceover. So I think that's really great. For a film that gives little time, I would say, to the core romantic relationship between the two main characters, or the main character that ends up in a relationship. I won't necessarily spoil that. The chemistry is great because there's not a lot of time given to that relationship compared to a lot of the other relationships in the film. And so that's just sort of a kudos to the acting and the directing, where we care about that relationship despite having not really seen it all that much on screen. It's really only either been talked about or kind of hinted at. So I thought that was just an example of how good the filmmaking is in particular. And speaking of the directing and the writing, which is both done by Amy Heckerling, the side characters are very well fleshed out, and whether or not they are fleshed out in a narrative sense, whether they're given a lot of time, a lot of storylines, they have very distinct character and personality traits that are very exciting and very unique, and obviously very specific. There's no character that feels like a double to another character in the film, or even a character that we've seen before. So I thought that is fantastic. The costuming, another one that I will say is iconic. I mean, you see multiple Chers every Halloween in the sort of double yellow plaid outfit. And the film wouldn't work without this costuming. In this over-the-top world with over-the-top dialogue and characters, you have to have a super stylistic over-the-top costume and wardrobe. And it has it that is super unique, not seen in many other movies like this, or nothing like this has been seen in teenage movies, I don't think. And it lends itself to the world of the film. So not only is it iconic and just necessary in the aesthetic of the film, but the aesthetic of the film lends itself to the story in a way that isn't always the case in films like this. And I want to emphasize the aesthetic and the story kind of colliding in this way, because it's pretty apparent within the first 30 minutes that this film doesn't necessarily exist in the real world. It's much more of a fantasy universe and an over-the-top universe, which is why it lets itself not take itself seriously and be so silly, but then have those moments of pretty dramatic or terrifying character moments that then have the light levity of it all and treat it as kind of a joke or a gag. This is one of those points where there's a little bit of a minor spoiler, but not too much. About 1/3 halfway through the movie, Cher gets held at gunpoint, and the first time I watched the movie, I was like, "Oh, like this isn't real life. This is not. This is a total fantasy." So I love that is a part of the film, and that the film gets to do that, because again, too many films are bogged down by realism. I don't know, maybe that's a hot take, but that's just me. The film itself is extremely charming, and part of that to me is how 90s it is. I was not really alive in the 90s. That's a little bit of a hint at how young I am, so sorry. But as far as the culture and aesthetic of the 90s, this seems to be a very clear reflection of it, which makes it that much more fun and that much more silly and very, very charming. And again, like I said, all the characters are very charming. The other thing that I like to point about the film that I really like is a lot of what is hailed as the best films of all time seem to be very masculine-driven films. Characters that are stoic and strong, and movies that are either violent or very quiet character studies, which isn't always masculine, but in the way that they're portrayed on screen and the cast and crew behind them, they tend to swing that way. I mean, if you look on IMDb, some of the best films of all time are Godfather, Shawshank. I think I did this one time. I looked through IMDb, and the first movie in the top 50 in like the top 250 movies, best movies of all time, the first movie with a lead female was like number 52 or something like that. And that's also obviously a critique of just Hollywood in general, not making enough movies like that. But IMDb, maybe not the best resource for the best movies of all time. But those are commonly hailed as some of the greatest films of all time. So that's not a knock at those in particular films, but there's this sense that if it's masculine, it's better. So that just seems to be something that is happening culturally and has happened for such a long time in film. And I do really like that Clueless gets to be a feminine movie that should be considered one of the greatest films of all time. Honestly, that is, for me, I feel as though that is an objective take. I know I'm coming at this subjectively, and I can't come at anything objectively, ultimately, but this should be in the conversation as one of the best scripts, because all around, everything about it is great, and it has an air of lightness, a lot of feminine traits, strong lead female characters, a female director, a female writer, nuanced characters as far as femininity goes, and particularly leads that don't abandon their femininity when trying to be strong and self-reliant. So, which is a very important message to be showing to people and just a very important thing to be putting on screen. So I do like that the film gets to be a fantastic film and doesn't abandon the identity that it wanted to have from the start and end up being sort of a masculinized thing. I don't even know if that's a word, but that's just how I feel about this film. So those are all the things about the film that I love. I adore this movie so much. Cannot recommend it enough. It is free on Netflix, so please go watch it. And so this is a strong 10. This is a very strong 10. Not as strong a 10 as Amazing Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Almost a Freudian slip with Amazing Spider-Man. But strong 10 out of 10. So that's Clueless. So next up, I'll have my review of Booksmart, another wonderful teenage movie. And then at the very end of the episode, I'll be running down my top 5 favorite LGBTQ plus centered films. But right now, we're going to take another quick break.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around, I have given my review on Big Time Adolescence as well as a review of Clueless. Right now, I am about to give my review on Booksmart, and then at the very end of the episode, stay tuned because I will be giving my list of top 5 Pride LGBTQ plus related films, which I am very excited about. So right now we're doing Booksmart, a movie that I love so much. This is my recommendation of the day. I don't love it quite as much as Clueless. Clueless just so happened to be the movie that I watched more recently, but this is just as much a recommendation, a very, very fun teen high school movie. So for those of you who don't know, it came out last year. Early 2019 is the directorial debut of Olivia Wilde. It centers around Amy and Molly, played by Caitlin Dever and Beanie Feldstein respectively, two nerdy high school seniors on the last day of senior year when they realized that all of the kids who partied and drank and did crazy things on the weekends got into colleges that are just as good, if not better than the colleges that they got into while they just hit the books all the time. So they feel as though they have been cheated and need to find the biggest party on their last night of high school. So from the get-go, it is a super fun, original premise, a wonderful buddy movie. I almost said buddy cop movie because it's kind of the same formula, but it's a buddy comedy, and it's hilarious. Do you ever find yourself seeing movies opening day by accident? Because that's what I did. I've done it a couple times. I did it for like Detective Pikachu for some reason. Anyway, I was seeing this movie with two of my best friends, and we just wanted to go see a movie. This was March of last year. And it just so happened that this one was coming out that day. And we were like, all right, let's go see this one. It's a fun teen movie. We basically just graduated high school. Let's see what this thing's about. The trailer was funny. Let's go do it. And it was so much better than I could have expected. Oh my God. It was hilarious. I think we were one of like a few people in the theater, and we were like dying in the back. It's so funny. I cannot emphasize enough how funny it is. And then like 2-3 days later, because this came out like a month after Avengers Endgame had come out, and another one of my friends was hanging out with us, and the three of them had not seen Avengers Endgame, and we were kind of just waiting around. We were about to go see it. We were waiting for the time to show up, and then we were all kind of like, including all of the friends that hadn't seen Endgame yet, they were like, we don't really want to see a 3-hour movie right now. And I think I was like, do you guys want to go see Booksmart again? And 3 of the 4 of us had already seen it. And we were like, yeah, let's go see Booksmart again. Because it is that good. It is so good. It flew under the radar, unbelievably underrated, kind of underperformed at the box office, which movies like this tend to underperform, particularly when they're up against movies like Avengers Endgame. But even still, underperformed more than it should have, more than it deserved. The story is so fun. The acting is brilliant. So I'll get into all of that. I will say that the main production studio of this is Annapurna, who is putting out some of the best films of the decade. The Master, Spring Breakers. So any movie that you see with that logo attached to it, I would recommend. A24 has been getting a lot of light as being one of the best indie studios, and I do think that they are the best indie studio, but I will say that Annapurna is pretty darn close. They're doing some pretty good stuff too. So that's a recommendation for the studio, and this film is one of their best. I haven't seen a lot of their best, so let's get right into it. Like I said, I had pretty much just left high school a year or two prior, and it's very realistic. I know that I have been not necessarily advocating for realism in film for the past 2 episodes, but there is a time and place for it, and this is one of those times because it is realistic, but it still has this level of optimism that I very much enjoy. It also, there's this, I think, notion that movies need to be timeless to be good, or at least not overemphasize the time period that they're from necessarily, particularly with comedies and movies like this, because then they feel dated. I think that this movie really embraces the fact that it is a teen movie for Gen Z without kind of hitting you over the head with it. It really hammers home all of the things that kids say, do, in a generation with smartphones and such a culturally rich generation. So I really appreciated that they didn't shy away from a lot of those things. So that was very, very nice. In particular, about 2/3 of the way through the movie, there is a party scene that makes up a big, big chunk of the film. It is probably the biggest, most important scene of the movie. And it was a very realistic party scene, and it was a very relatable party scene that I loved. I think there's this thing in a lot of teen movies where the dorky, nerdy kids get ridiculed even at big party events, and the two nerdiest kids, the class presidents, the main characters, show up to this party, and all of the other kids are drunk or stoned and are like loving and embracing the kids that are there, which I thought was adorable and so fun. All of the side characters really get a chance to shine, and more so, I would say, than like comparatively to Big Time Adolescence that I reviewed earlier. The side characters get very humanizing moments, and moments that are very relatable, that even if they're only on screen for a couple minutes, 20 minutes, all of the side characters feel like whole characters, which was really, really nice. This feels like a movie that people can look back on as a fantastic ensemble cast of young actors. I would be very surprised if most of these actors don't become big in the coming years. In particular, the 2 leads, Caitlin Dever and Beanie Feldstein, are fantastic. They completely carry this film. They're in every scene. I believe at least one of them is in every single scene. And for 2 actors that I had never seen act before, their comedy chops are off the charts. Their chemistry was fantastic. Everybody in the cast, but particularly these 2, their timing was great. There are some big comedic actors in this movie. Will Forte, Jason Sudeikis, Lisa Kudrow. And all of the kids, but particularly, again, these two, hold their own with these seasoned comedic actors, which I thought was great. Like I said, this movie is pretty realistic in its depiction, but I would say that it's a good mix of Clueless and Big Time Adolescence, because it kind of balances the line of being super over the top sometimes and super realistic other times, and realistic still in an optimistic way, even when there are moments of lowest lows and some sad, tragic moments. There's a particular moment in the movie that hits very hard. It's a huge gut punch. Not necessarily nearly as anxiety-inducing or cringy as Big Time Adolescence, and not nearly as much of a downer. But it balances that line really, really well of being fun and realistic at the same time, and then also it can be over the top sometimes, because it still is a high school teen comedy, particularly the ending. There is a big, grandiose ending, which I thought was still very fitting and still very fun. Like I said, there's that emotional gut punch, and part of that is because of the soundtrack and the score, which I will shout out more so than I did for the past two movies. The score is done by a guy named Dan the Automator, who I don't know if he had done any film scores before this. I assume that he had maybe done one or two, but he's primarily a electronic DJ, and his score is very unique. Uses a lot of hip-hop trap elements, particularly in the drums, with sort of a more symphonic score to go with it, and that's where a lot of these emotionally poignant moments come from, which I thought was great. And then the soundtrack is super original and super fun. There's a lot of artists that I had either never heard of or only heard of a little bit. It also kind of capitalized on the Lizzo phenomenon of 2019, because they had been blasting it on set apparently, and then they also incorporate one or two of her songs in the soundtrack, and so the soundtrack is very fitting to a current generation with Lizzo and Run the Jewels and Anderson .Paak. So there are some really fun musical artists on the soundtrack that just enhance the fun and lightness of the film overall. It is the directorial debut of Olivia Wilde, and as far as filmmaking goes, much like Big Time Adolescence, on the surface, I couldn't notice a lot of strong directorial choices, except for some over-the-top multimedia moments, which was out of the blue and very welcomed. I thought it was a very unique choice to do, and I thought it was very, very fun. But the comedy and the performances and the chemistry, I think, lends itself to the directing, because Olivia Wilde, I think, gave these young kids the chance to have fun and goof around on set, which shines through in all of the acting and all of the relationships. So I think that ability to maybe even improv, I would believe that there are some improv moments, particularly with Lisa Kudrow and Will Forte, and also with Beanie and Caitlin Dever. So I think that is part of where the directing comes in. And so there might not be a lot of strong stylistic choices in the filmmaking, but as far as a focus on the acting and the performances, that seems to really shine for Olivia Wilde. So it was a really great directorial debut, because particularly for me, I think there is a notion in a lot of filmmakers, film students, to say that style over substance sometimes, that filmmaking and the style of a movie is just as important, if not more important, than the substance of the movie, which, again, I might not disagree with, particularly on specific accounts, but I'm somebody who has always championed characters over anything. If you can get really relatable, good, interesting, fun characters on screen, you're going to get people attached to the story, and you're going to get people who really relate to your film and really end up enjoying your film. So this is something that Booksmart really, really does right. Like I said earlier, it is laugh out loud funny. The comedy is so quick, and it really plays to the strengths, I think, of every comedic actor in it. Each actor is given multiple lines that are specific to them as a character, that are hilarious, laugh out loud, and there are also some really fun visual moments for these characters that are also very funny. There's a lot of different locations. The film moves very quickly, much like World War Z that I had said last week. And the comedy suits that because the comedy also moves very quickly. One of my favorite characters in the film is played by Billie Lourd, named Gigi, who's Carrie Fisher's daughter. And she is the scene stealer. She's so funny. She's so good. The film is a little bit raunchy, because other than that, I would say it is a fantastic family movie. It's a very fun movie, but it does have an R rating. So I would say it's an older family movie for sure. I watched it with my family, but all of us are in high school or parents. So it's a fun family movie if everyone is mature enough to watch it, because it is still a little bit raunchy. So I will say that. But like I said, all of the actors and young people in this film create a wonderful ensemble and a wonderful comedy, buddy comedy, teen comedy. I think it should be held up with some of the best teen comedies of all time, specific to those generations, with the 80s and then, like I said, Clueless. Like I reviewed Clueless. So yeah, love this movie. I love it so much. So I'm going to give this movie a strong 9, possibly even a light 10. I do love this movie. I haven't created a top 50 list. It might be in there. But yeah, it's my favorite teen comedy to come out recently. I emphasize comedy on that because there are some teen movies that have come out recently that are still very good. Lady Bird, Edge of 17, that serve as comedies, but maybe emphasize the drama a little bit more than Booksmart does, because Booksmart is just such a good feel-good movie. So I love Booksmart. It is streaming for free on Hulu right now. Please go watch it. Very much recommend it. So we've got one more segment left, and in that segment, I'm going to be running down my top 5 list of favorite LGBTQ plus related films for Pride Month as the last episode in June. So stay tuned for that as we go to one more break. See you in a minute.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Casey Baum. If you are just tuning in or skipping around a little bit, I have given my review of Big Time Adolescence, Clueless, and Booksmart, 3 overall very good teen coming-of-age movies, but I am now transitioning a little bit into my final topic, my final segment. There is a little bit of a segue from Booksmart into this category, but I am giving my top 5 LGBTQ plus pride-centered films. Given that it is June and that is Pride Month, I wanted to honor that in the last episode of June, make sure I got it in before we hit July, hit a different month, a whole different thing going on there. So these are those films. Obviously, due to COVID-19, there are not a lot of public, if any, Pride celebrations, festivals, parades, and so we got to find other ways to celebrate, and one of those is through films, with diversity and inclusion being such a beautiful, powerful, and necessary tool happening in film. So that's what I wanted to celebrate today. And obviously with the top 5 list, it's a little bit difficult because there are only so many movies that I've seen. I've not seen everything, and there are some movies that might be on this list if I had seen them. So I can't necessarily satisfy everybody. If there are some movies on this list that you disagree with, or movies that you think should be on this list, or you have recommendations or a total other top 5 list, please tweet me at GSMC_movies. I'm checking that Twitter account every day. I would love to interact with you guys, and I would love to hear everybody's thoughts. I love the whole media discourse. I think it's very, very fun. So without further ado, let's get started with number 5. And so my number 5 film is called Moonlight. I assume a lot of you guys have heard of this film. It won Best Picture at the Oscars, if anybody's heard of that. So it's a pretty popular film. It centers around Chiron, a young black man struggling with his race and his sexuality in a primarily conservative environment, or at least not nearly as accepting of an environment as you would like to be growing up in this time period, in that time frame of your life. And so this film is extremely powerful. It's not necessarily my favorite A24 film, but it is definitely the A24 film that has given them the most notoriety. It's obviously very well written, very well directed. Barry Jenkins, who adapted it from a play, which I have not seen or read, but given the accolades and how good of a film it is, I have to imagine is pretty good of an adaptation, because it was a pretty popular play to begin with. So I think this movie is beautiful. The cinematography and the score are haunting. There are some wonderful performances from Mahershala Ali, Naomi Harris, Janelle Monáe, Trevante Rhodes, and it's a very powerful story with the intersection of blackness and queerness and how necessary it is to be talking about intersectionality in times like this. So it is a very important story to be told, and it is very well told. I will say that I was not expecting how much of an artsy film that it was. It is not a conventional narrative necessarily. It's told in 3 chapters, and you know how I am with movies and chapters. I did love that, but I didn't know how dramatic and how unconventional it would be. Maybe I'm hyping that up. That's just not what I was expecting going into it. So I think if you know that going in, you're going to enjoy it very, very much. There's a very interesting either article or video, I can't quite remember, by Issa Rae, who is the creator and star of Insecure on HBO, and she does a whole explanation of how to light black characters, particularly in very dark settings, which I find very fascinating, and was used very specifically, or similar techniques and tactics were used in this film, in lighting characters like that through blue, purple, and pink lighting, and then each chapter is kind of emphasized with one of those colors. So there's definitely a very strong motif going on with the colors. The name of the play was originally in Moonlight, Black Boys Look Blue. So there's definitely a very strong theme and motif going on there, which is important to take note of. So I think this movie is beautiful. I love this movie, and if you're ready for a dramatic, gut-wrenching, powerful film, I would definitely recommend this one. Number 4, we have a film called Tangerine, which centers around 2 black sex workers, transgender sex workers in California, as one of them tries to find the pimp that broke her heart on Christmas Eve. So it is a very unique story, very original. It's also shot all on an iPhone, which is one of the reasons that it gained so much notoriety. It is directed by Sean Baker, who it is not his first film, but is definitely the film that brought him into the limelight for sure. And I think part of that is because of how original a story it was and the fact that it was shot on an iPhone. He went on to direct the Florida Project, for those of you who don't know. But the story is very well told. I will say that it is a very visceral experience. I think it is I use this term in a very specific way. It is the grimiest, kind of dirtiest, unfiltered film that I have ever seen, particularly because it's shot on an iPhone. So it kind of emphasizes that realistic, gritty, in-your-face filmmaking style that I think the story lends itself to. The 2 main characters are also played by trans actors, which I think is very important, both for inclusion and for media representation. I think it's important to have transgender actors in trans roles. So this is definitely a very unique filmmaking experience. It is not necessarily the easiest watch, I will say that. I also think that I watched this on an iPhone, which is not the best experience to be doing, but it is well written. It is very well acted, very well performed with people who I had never seen before, actors who I had never seen before. So some great performances there, and I really appreciate this film, and I do really like this film. So make sure that you're emotionally prepared for the film itself, but Tangerine is number 4 on the list. It's a great film. Number 3 is probably the most controversial film on this list, most likely. It's called The Children's Hour. It's a film from 1961, also adapted from a play. And I put it on the list partly because of the fact that it's a little bit more controversial, and it's from the 60s, so it's one of the first, I would say one of the first, definitely not the first, portrayal of queerness or lesbians on screen, but it is one of the first films, and possibly the first, that fully centers around that as the plot line. So it centers around 2 teachers at a children's school, and one of their students accuses the two head female teachers of having a relationship, and gets family and law officials to investigate. So it is a little bit harder of a watch, particularly nowadays. It's definitely fairly controversial nowadays, given obviously times have changed as far as acceptance goes, and as far as what is appropriate to be showing on screen. This was sort of at a time where censorship was dwindling for popular films, and so where there were things that were being shown on film that had never been shown before, particularly queer relationships, gay relationships, was known as sex perversion, and so that was not allowed in a lot of mainstream films, and this was one of those first films that kind of tore that down. So it's important to know the history behind queerness in film, and so that's another reason I put this on the list. I also think that it's just a very well acted film. It's a very well done movie. It's well written. Part of that, I think, is because it was a stage play, and it's primarily in one location. Audrey Hepburn and Shirley MacLaine are both in it, so some great performances there. I also think there is a little bit of an innocence in some of these characters because of the fact that they weren't necessarily treated as queer characters. They were just treated as characters, which feels like the appropriate thing to do. Like nowadays it's kind of like duh. But for the time it was revolutionary, the fact that characters like this were not getting antagonized. So I think it is an important film to be watching, to know the history of. I also think it is a very good film, despite all of the controversial problems that it might have with watching it in a more modern lens. So make sure that you are aware of that going in. It is not a perfect film, but it is a film that I definitely enjoy. I'm a little bit more partial to it, I think, because I saw it in a large crowd with one of the writers of it. So I was just given the opportunity to see it that way. And so that's one of the reasons it's on the list for sure. Obviously, I want to be transparent for that, but it is a film that I enjoy, a film that I think is very important, and a pretty good example of how early some of these topics, probably not early enough in my opinion, but were shown on screen in the history of film. So a good thing to know, and a pretty good film. Next up is Milk, which is a biopic. So it was number 2, by the way, if everyone's keeping score back at home. It is a biopic about the life and times of Harvey Milk, who is a gay activist, was a gay activist, and became California's first openly gay elected official. So it is a pretty long, actually it's not that long. It's 2 hours and 8 minutes. I'm looking at the page right now. Feels a little bit longer than that. But I'm not a huge fan of biopics, I will say that. But this is definitely one of, if not my favorite biopic. It is very well directed, extremely well acted. It has an all-star cast with Sean Penn, Josh Brolin, James Franco, Alison Pill. So it's got a lot of notable people, a lot of fantastic performances. And like I said, with history, this is not necessarily the history of queerness in film, but it is definitely a history of gay activism and gay people in politics. So very important to know, historically speaking. It is also a pretty I don't want to say fun because there are some very bad things that happen in this movie, but there are some very fun moments. The chemistry between a lot of characters is really, really great. I will say the acting is what shines through the most. I knew very little about who Harvey Milk was at the time of watching it, and so I think it is overall just a fantastically well done biopic. I strongly, strongly recommend this. There's not a lot that I can say as far as like what stands out the most because of the fact that I haven't seen it in a while, and I think almost every aspect of this movie is strong, so there's none that really stands out one over the other. But it is a story of America and queerness and one of the most important queer activists of his time and in American history. So a very, very good film. And that's number 2. And now we're moving on to number 1, which is also the most recent film. In fact, I saw it like 4 months ago. It's Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Whew, wow. It is a very, very good film. It is one of the most original premises I have ever seen. It takes place in the 18th, 19th century. I can't quite remember when, but it centers around a rich woman who is getting courted off to royalty in another country, but the man needs to have a portrait of her to make sure that she is beautiful enough to marry. And so another woman, a painter, comes to the isolated island that she is on and paints her portrait in secret, and there is a budding romance that happens between the two of them. So it's beautiful. It's gorgeous. The cinematography is gorgeous. The acting is gorgeous. Like I said, an extremely original premise. The script is fantastic. It's just one of those high concept films. I mean, with the time period and the concept of a portrait painter, I don't know. I've just never seen something like that before. The title, love the title, Portrait of a Lady on Fire. Just very cool title. It is French. Make sure you know that going in. It's a foreign film, but foreign films, I think, in America in particular, not a lot of people watch them on the regular, but it's like, if you're just watching films from the US, like you're not getting a full film experience. So I will say that it is important to watch films from other countries. And this is one of my favorites to come out recently. The relationship is beautiful. The chemistry is fantastic. It is I would say a pretty cute relationship. I definitely had a very fun time watching it. Part of that is the chemistry. Part of that is the characters. There are some beautiful shots. One of the shots in the film is one of my favorite shots, maybe ever, definitely recently. I'm going to say my favorite for a lot of things all the time. It's just something that I do. But this one in particular, it involves a hand mirror. So I assume that if you've seen the film or if you're going to see the film, you'll know what I'm talking about there. So Portrait of a Lady on Fire is overall just fantastic. The ending, I cried. The score is crazy. The themes and the writing, again, much like Milk, everything is good, so I can't necessarily say one thing stands out over the other. So watch it. This one is streaming for free on Hulu. I do know that. So recommend this one highly. And that's it. That's the episode. Thank you guys so much for listening. I had a really fun time today talking about teen coming of age movies. I reviewed Big Time Adolescence, Clueless, and Booksmart. So I hope you enjoyed all of that and ran down my top 5 favorite Pride films for Pride Month. So happy Pride Month, happy end of June. I hope that all of you are staying safe. Obviously, there is still a global pandemic going on, so make sure that you are staying inside as much as possible, keeping a mask on. If you got to go outside, maintaining social distancing. So please, everybody, stay safe, be kind. And thank you for listening to the GSMC Movie Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I would like to ask that you please remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review because that really helps us. Also, if you can please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for listening, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Movie Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.